Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Embassy of Italy for the latest installment of our digital diplomacy series. Today's focus is space, something that we don't often associate with diplomacy or foreign policy. Space diplomacy is very much part of the relations between Italy and the United States, and it has been for over 50 years at this point. The collaboration between Italy and the United States in the space sector began in 1962, when thanks to the agreement with NASA, the first Italian satellite, the San Marco, was launched. Italy thus became the third country in the world to launch an artificial satellite to Earth's orbit. But space diplomacy is more than just bilateral relations. It's about policy, technology, communications, and engaging with all stakeholders at all levels, including the general public and civil society. It is as much about looking up to the sky as it is about looking down to planet Earth. This is an incredible time to talk about space. Not only is it the year we're celebrating the first moon landing, it's also the year that marks the 500th anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci's death. Leonardo, like many before and after him, always looked up at the sky. He was the first one to prototype and sketch a flying machine. But little known to most, one of Leonardo's finest works is not a painting or an invention, but rather something from astronomy. He solved the ancient riddle of earthshine, or the glow caused by sunlight reflected off the Earth, especially on the darker portion of our crescent moon. And now, 500 years later, we still marvel at the sky and at space. In the past few decades, space has entered a second age. It has become a focus for the private sector as well as for the public sector. It now offers new opportunities, whether it's about commercial flights or telecommunication satellites to expand the access to the internet down on planet Earth. So we're excited to welcome our speakers today to explore how tech and the digital age have changed the way we look at space. Special thanks to Jacqueline Klimas, our moderator tonight. She's a space reporter at POLITICO, where she also authors the Political Space newsletter. Prior to joining POLITICO, she was at the Washington Times and the Washington Examiner. She's an alumna of Boston University and holds a master in journalism from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Thank you also to Rachel DalBello from Virgin Galactic, Katie Dowd from OneWeb, and she's at her second appearance here at our diplomacy series, as she was one of the very first panelists in 2013. Matt Shindell from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and Jim Wilson from NASA. So thank you all for choosing the Embassy of Italy tonight, and please use hashtags, hashtag digital diplomacy, and hashtag Leonardo500 to post on social media. Jacqueline, you have the floor. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to thank you guys all for joining us today. As long as there have been people, there has been interest. Is it on? Am I good? Okay. As long as there have been people, there has been an interest in the stars, but technology is really the thing that has allowed us to go farther than any early scientist ever dreamed possible. As was already mentioned, more than 500 years ago, Leonardo da Vinci solved the mystery of the moonshine, and hundreds of years later, humans took their first steps onto the moon's surface that da Vinci could only dream about in his imagination. Today, we have the Parker Solar Probe circling the sun closer than any previous object. NASA recently landed a new robotic platform on Mars late last year, and the Hubble telescope is looking beyond our solar system. And that's just what the government is doing in the US. We have international partners and the commercial sphere, which is getting ready to send people to space on vacation and is bringing internet to the masses. But technology hasn't only changed what we can do in space, it's also changed how we can talk about space. People can watch rocket launches live around the world. They can communicate with astronauts on the International Space Station. I was watching a spacewalk happen last week in real time, miles above the Earth's surface, which is just mind-blowing. And people can follow the adventures of robotic rovers on other worlds on social media, causing quite the stir as we saw when the world mourned the loss of Opportunity rover on Mars. So there's a lot to dig into. We have a great panel with us today to dig into it all. Matt Shindell, all the way on my left, is the co-host of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's podcast, and he also has a book coming out this fall about planetary scientist Harold Urey. Richard DalBello is the Vice President of Business Development and Government Affairs at Virgin Galactic. We have Katie Dowd, the Director of Communications at satellite constellation company OneWeb, and Jim Wilson, who does web and video public affairs at NASA and previously spent 9 years at CNN. So thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. One quick programming note before we kick off: we will be coming to the audience in the latter half of the conversation for questions, so jot them down and be ready for that later on. So Matt, I wanted to start with you. How has the way that people can even dream and imagine what we can do in space, how has that changed with technology over the years?
Well, if we go all the way back to Leonardo da Vinci's time, I mean the 15th century Renaissance, the universe that da Vinci lived in was very different from the one that we understand that we live in today. And a lot of that is thanks to developments in technology that have helped us to explore our own solar system and to learn, for example, just how many other solar systems there are out there. If you look at the work of the Kepler Space Telescope recently, discovering that there are thousands of solar systems just in one part of the sky that the Kepler has looked at. In Da Vinci's time, that would have been impossible to imagine because the Earth was the center of the universe and there were no other solar systems imaginable. So it was technology partly, but also changes in philosophy, how mankind saw themselves in relation to the universe that changed. And if we look just back, not as far as Leonardo, but maybe just the last 60 years of planetary exploration, just our understanding of the planets that are our neighbors in the solar system have changed so dramatically that it's hard to imagine, what people actually thought about the planets even just 60 years ago, to go back that far. And now thinking about possible trips for not just astronauts, but regular fare-paying tourists to the moon and to the planets, that's another kind of radical leap forward.
This leads very well to my next question for you, Richard. Sending tourists to space is something that just would have been unthinkable. What sort of technology, what has it taken for now to be the time for this to be happening? Because we've seen Virgin, they had their first flight recently. It's actually happening now.
Well, I hope so. It's been a long time. So, obviously it's been a long history of the space program. I mean, we've had, now some, 50, 60 years of the development of rocket technology. And I think the challenge that we had was to try to create a system that was simple, safe, repeatable, and could approach something like airline operations, since we also had to create a system where the cost was within the reach. Now, granted, at the beginning, the cost is pretty high at $250,000 a seat, but so was the cost of international air travel when aviation first started, and so was the cost of the first computers and the cost of the first flat panel televisions. I think our hope and goal is that the technology continues to rapidly advance such that we can go in two directions. One is significantly reduce the price of what we're doing, but two, also continue the technology maturation and go from a natural step from saying, let's go visit space and return in a routine operation to let's go visit space and return somewhere else. So you get to the point where you're talking about rocket-powered flights from here to Tokyo in a very, very short period of time. So as those technologies for point-to-point transport around the world are also technologies that people have in their scope as future commercial objectives, and then you would truly get the blending of the aviation industry and the space industry in a way that it hasn't happened. But specifically in terms of what technologies, we had to come up with a rocket engine primarily, which was safe, affordable, repeatable. And we created a hybrid system that is part solid and part gas. It's a nitrous gas passing through a special rubber compound that creates the lift, and that whole piece, the whole rocket motor segment, is literally taken out and replaced like a battery after every flight. So, and our first motor, which we donated, and very kindly the Air and Space Museum offered to accept the first motor. We flew to space, so it is now out at the Ed Varghese Center out near Dulles, Virginia.
So Katie, your company is doing pretty incredible things in space as well. OneWeb this year is expected to start launching its satellite constellation that will bring high-speed internet to previously unserved populations. How is space making this possible, and what sort of doors can this open?
Thank you for having me. I do think that there have been some incredible advancements in the space industry, and that is bringing costs down. And so Richard was talking about affordability, and this affordability is allowing new companies to enter into using space, one, in ways previously unimagined, but two, to use it for technologies that we can now expand upon. Using satellite for communications is not a new concept, but at a company like OneWeb, what we're aiming to do is build a constellation of approximately 650 satellites to start that will provide broadband speed internet to everywhere on Earth, but really what we'll be able to do is uniquely offer service in places that have previously been unreachable, either because the terrain is difficult to get to or the populations are sparse, and you might not have fiber extended out to those areas. And so back to your point, I think the cost of doing business in space is coming down. Launches are going to get more affordable. The cost of manufacturing satellites is coming down. Those innovations are going to pave the way for companies like OneWeb, but also universities are launching satellites. I mean, you're seeing a whole wave of people looking at how to use space in new and different ways. An exciting opportunity, and how we do it thoughtfully, responsibly, but also make use of this resource, I think, is one of the exciting eras.
The fact that the cost of launch and cost of this technology is coming down, what does it mean that more people will be able to reach? What sort of implications does that have?
So I think, there's good and bad implications, right? That means there's more people who are able to dream up ways to use the resource. It means we need to be thoughtful and responsible about using these resources. For a company like OneWeb, who's thinking of launching hundreds and hundreds of satellites, we need to think about putting them up there responsibly. We need to think about deorbiting them responsibly, so we leave space, we protect space for future generations. That's hugely important to us and was hugely important in the design of our constellation. But I think, you're seeing conversations happen about how to use, what weather, education. There's so many, for better weather resources, better types of communications, different types of I think that there's a whole range of opportunity Space Force. You could probably go into a whole, there's a whole range of, when I say that in a joking way, there's a ton of opportunities, and because cost of launching and operating is coming down, more people are thinking about how to use it in creative ways, and we need to manage the conversation about how we do that go forward.
Great. So Jim, you've been at NASA for almost 16 years, you said. And obviously a lot has changed in technology on Earth as well. How has the agency changed the way it communicates its mission over that time?
Thanks. So first of all, we're super lucky in that, touching on what was said about Leonardo and going back even before then, people have dreamed of going to space, fascination with celestial bodies and things like that. So we have great content, right? We don't have to oversell what we do. Sometimes it's just posting an awesome picture of the moon or something, and it's amazing, performs amazingly well. What we have seen is, I can think of 3 areas where things have evolved since I started NASA in 2003. The main one to me is this, and I've got my little NASA iPhone case if you check that out. So, you know, you said earlier, you know, we can watch a spacewalk in real time. We can watch launches. You can do it all on this thing. I can be anywhere in the world. If I've got service, I can watch live from space. We really found out when we started doing launches out of Wallops Island in Southern Virginia. We would post information that people along the eastern seaboard could actually see the launches. And what we started seeing in our metrics and our analytics is the mobile numbers just shot up like crazy, and you could actually track geographically all along these little pockets along the East Coast because people are standing out in their yard looking up in the sky, and they're going like this, has it launched yet? So we learned, okay, wow, we really need to make sure that we make this stuff work on mobile. So this is one thing. The other thing has been, you know, not just the hardware, but the platforms, all the social media. It's just expanded greatly the ways that we can get directly to the audience. And you've seen an evolution in communications from, you know, the traditional public affairs model of we're going to put material out there and then the media is going to repurpose that material and tell the story. We still do that. We still do press releases. We still do video files. We still do raw feeds. But we also can produce our own stuff and go directly to our followers because we have these platforms. And the other thing is, one of my pet projects is analytics. We have all this software now. We have all these platforms like Google Analytics and other metrics platforms that let us have real insights into our audience behavior. So we're not just kind of blasting everything out there and guessing and hoping it works. We know what strategies for communication work on what platforms, so we can tailor to fit that.
Matt, I'm hoping you can weigh in here too about how technology and social media and the internet are changing the ways that people can interact with the museum in DC and elsewhere.
Yeah, so at the museum, of course, we're really interested in tapping social media and web-based platforms for sharing the stories that our museum can tell with a broader public. The Smithsonian has a goal that was part of our strategic plan that was released a couple years ago, which was to reach 1 billion people per year, which is a lot more people than we can actually reach from actually bringing them physically into the buildings. So, you know, web is a big part of that strategy. For our museum, we have a pretty strategic approach to the web. We're still kind of defining what that website's going to look like when the museum is done with its renovations. If you haven't heard, the Air and Space Museum is being completely renovated over the next 6 years or so, and our web presence is also being rethought. And of course, we have the podcast that I co-host with two of my colleagues there at the museum, and you know, this is another effort where we're trying to reach people that we're not normally reaching as a museum. But we realize that people are interacting with space news and space history in new ways now that the web exists. I mean, on my Facebook feed, I'm constantly getting stories coming out from, it seems like there's a new website or content source practically every day sending space news kind of around Facebook and around the internet. And I would say there's a connection between these things, between space exploration and social media that people maybe don't appreciate, which is that a lot of the technological advances that have made this phone possible and, you know, the network that we are all attached to now, a lot of those same advances are what has kept planetary exploration going, because the miniaturization of technology, the development of new and more powerful processors, new materials, this is what has brought down the cost of robotic planetary exploration and really makes it possible to send rovers to Mars without totally breaking the bank while doing it. And just that improvement of camera technology, like the development of the CCD that everybody pretty much has in their phone or their digital camera, you know, this has made planetary imaging so much better than when we were using essentially television cameras on the early planetary exploration missions. So digital imaging and the technologies that have gone into that, the development of those has really benefited planetary exploration. So the way that we live, this sort of social way that we live and use technology, has contributed to our capabilities in space. People often think about technologies spinning off of space exploration and then going out into the public sector, but in fact, or the private sector. In fact, you know, there's a lot of movement the other direction as well.
I had never thought about it that way. So now I want to turn a little bit to the relationship between the government space programs and the commercial space programs. When men were walking on the moon, there wasn't really a commercial space program to speak of, and now that technology is growing, these two groups are having to coexist. So Richard, I want to start with you. How is the rapid rise in technology outside the government changing the relationship between the government and the commercial realm?
Well, I think Matt actually just alluded to it. Is that originally, I think in the space program, the assumption was, starting out in the 50s and 60s, the idea was that this was going to be a government-organized, funded effort, and that there would be benefits in it, that would be ancillary to the core benefit of the exploration or the science we're doing. And I think that really we're working on a completely different paradigm now. So sort of two observations. One is that there is the recent revolution in technology did not come from the government to industry. It came from industry to government. And that was and that was because it was a revolution that took place across many, many industries. Microelectronics, imaging, computer power, artificial intelligence, new control systems, and all of these things were developed for other bits and pieces. And what the magic of the revolution that we're in right now, the whole small sat revolution, is that all of these technologies are now coming together in ways, first of all, because they have other big commercial markets. The cost of them are dramatically cheaper than they would be if they were built specifically for one narrow market. So I do think that part of the great energy in the space business today is that we're sort of reaping the benefits of all those individual technologies. And I think another interesting observation is to ask whether the paradigm that we've always had, that the governments would lead and the industry would follow, is the paradigm, really, if you look back in history, it's not really always been the case, right? There are many examples of where the private individuals and private foundations funded important breakthroughs. In aviation, there was a tremendous amount of private company investment, private company innovation. And so I think obviously the government, to do things like we're going to go to Mars, I still think that government will be deeply involved, and it'll probably be an international effort. But there's going to be a lot of activity where the private sector can see an opportunity, either like we are trying to do with tourism, or someone will see an opportunity to build a small factory in space or something like that. There will be opportunities where the private sector will lead. And I think that's what makes the place we are now in the history of space so exciting and fun.
Katie, is there anything you'd like to add here, given that your company is also doing something sort of uniquely commercial?
Just adding on that, I think everything Richard said is right about the shift in the paradigm, and that we still need to do this in collaboration with government. Without question, we need to go up there and coexist with one another, and that's there's a lot of companies that are looking to do a range of different things, and again, I think we need to be able to work together and collaborate together, and to be able to do that, we're going to need government to help build thoughtful regulations, thoughtful guidelines, best practices, and that's something you've seen here in DC. The administration has taken on the Space Policy Directive. They have had conversations about what are the best practices for how the commercial sectors go to space, be thoughtful, and work together. It doesn't mean that there still aren't more answers that need to be done, but we're having a conversation now about how can we learn from the private sector, how can we work with government, and what are the right steps to take forward. So I think we're having a unique conversation in this.
Can I comment on that? I think that one of the things people always assume, which is not correct, is that somehow there's this already in place governmental management of space system. We have this wonderful system that we developed for aviation over the last 100 years. where basically individual governments make very complicated decisions about safety and technology. Then those governments get together and they come up with regional and then international agreements, and eventually it's all rolled up. There's an organization called the International Civil Aviation Organization, which kind of serves as a common platform for deciding on complicated aviation issues. There is nothing similar to that today in space. So nations do, by and large, let each other know when they're going to space, often not immediately. And sometimes, and for the most part, they do announce what they're doing, although not entirely. And now that we have all these new actors, I think what Katie was saying, and I couldn't agree more, is that one of the great challenges we have is in the management of this new regime. And in part, the objects in space are not very easy to manage, because once an object's in space, it's not like an airplane. You can't tell it to bank left or bank right. Really, the Kepler's laws are fully in control of how things travel around the world. And so we need a new way of managing space as we go forward. And also the other comment Katie made about needing to come fully to grips with the debris issue, often sensationalized in Hollywood movies, but very serious. All these objects are traveling at phenomenal speeds, so even small objects have tremendous impact when they hit. So we need to come to grips with both of these issues. How do we keep our environment sustainable? And how do we manage our activities so that as we do more, that we do it in collaboration with all nations so that everyone can continue to be creative and innovative?
I do want to dig a little more and a little bit into sort of how the regulatory regime needs to change to accommodate today's technology and today's environment. But before we move on, Jim, you mentioned you had a good story here about how NASA, from the government side, how NASA and the commercial space communities are coexisting. Yeah,
and this is less about sort of the big picture policy. More, my world is more the communication side, telling the story. So a few weeks ago, everybody probably knows, SpaceX launched its first commercial crew flight, an uncrewed test flight, but NASA and SpaceX worked for several years on a joint TV broadcast for this. And, it may not seem like a huge thing. It may seem like, well, of course you would. But what we saw was through the commercial flights, the commercial cargo flights that we were already doing, we were doing dual broadcasts. We were doing our traditional NASA launch coverage. SpaceX was doing their webcast. And boy, the cultures are really different, right? If you've watched both of these, I'm not telling anyone something you don't know. I mean, they're launching Teslas with, David Bowie, and they're cheering. And so we said, let's not compete with each other. Let's not try to, make people choose which webcast to watch. So I think they did a really good job, and I don't know if people in here saw the coverage, but they managed to cover the NASA stuff and the SpaceX stuff. They had a NASA person and a SpaceX person side by side. They went out to Hawthorne, where SpaceX has its headquarters. They went to Kennedy, where the thing was being launched. And it was a good example of, even though we are so different culturally and historically, we can pull this show together. And there was, of course, a lot of behind-the-scenes sausage-making stuff that I wouldn't bore everyone here with. But it was a huge effort to pull that off. And I think the one thing everyone was most impressed with is, boy, you really did this integrated show. There's some tweaks that we want to make for when we start launching humans. Now, the other side of that is kind of goes a little bit to something I mentioned before. I'll just be real quick with this. And, we do still have that feeding the media function. So on the one hand, we're kind of producing our own show. And if you watch that thing from start to finish, you wouldn't have needed to watch anyone else's coverage because we were the anchors and we were the reporters and we were in the field. But if the media is going to take a feed, that doesn't work for them. It doesn't work if CBS goes live to coverage and we've got a bunch of NASA faces popping up on it, right? So we have to continue to do both things. We have to give them a raw, clean feed for their use and produce a feed on our side.
And Matt, I'm hoping you can weigh in quickly about how the museum is adapting to no longer being just an archive of government space?
Hey, well, first I object to that characterization. I think we have a lot of exciting non-governmental stuff too, but it's a fair criticism. I guess if you look at us in a certain way, we have had a historic relationship with NASA. It's called the NASA-NASM Agreement, very sexy name, in which we get first dibs at things that NASA is.
Two acronyms for the price of one.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, we've had that historic relationship where we've had, access to materials from NASA ever since we opened in 1976. And one of the first things that happened was several truckloads of material from previous missions was dropped off at the museum. Some of it with very little information about what it was, and we're still trying to categorize some of that stuff. But yeah, I mentioned that we're renovating the museum, and one of the things we're doing is we're adding a couple of new galleries, and one of those is going to be dedicated to commercial space and talking about how this relationship between government and commercial space industries is changing. I mean, industries have been involved in NASA's exploration program since the very beginning. If you look at Apollo, if you saw the recent documentary of Apollo 11, for example, you see a lot of corporate logos on the jackets that people are wearing in mission control, and that's because companies like Boeing and other big aerospace companies of the time really did a lot of the engineering work behind the success of that program. What's changing now is the relationship, I think, between government and private industry, and it's going to be interesting to see how that actually takes shape. And one of the things we want our new gallery to do is to be a place where people can become engaged in that conversation, so that as the regulatory landscape emerges, our citizenry will feel like they're capable of participating in the national dialogue about what that should look like.
I just want to say quickly, it wasn't intended as a criticism. Seeing the space shuttle in person still gives me goosebumps. So there's lots of very cool stuff there. So I want to go back to this regulatory conversation a little bit. The nation is operating today under regulations that were written when some of these things like on-orbit satellite servicing didn't even exist. So Richard, I'm hoping you can talk about, you guys are doing something very different with space tourism. Are there any regulations today that need to be updated for you guys to meet your mission?
Yes, to first acknowledge we're here in the beautiful Italian embassy, and this is a inherently international setting. And I think the first issue that I would raise would be that, we have export laws that were written at a time when governments assumed that only governments controlled technology. And the idea was to build barriers around the flow of those technologies. Now, I think today we're entering an era where it's time to relook at those assumptions. We have technologies today that will be able, as I said, soon to travel across the planet in ways that we never thought of before. And so since Virgin has two space companies, Virgin Galactic, which does the missions to space for science and tourism, and Virgin Orbit, which does launching small satellites to space. And both of them rely on aircraft. So we could technically do operations pretty much anywhere on the planet. But the rules that we live under today say we can't fly outside the States. So I think those rules need to be rethought, and the export control laws. And just, I think literally a week ago or 2 weeks ago, both the State Department and the Commerce Department put out a public notice that they're looking for recommendations on how those laws ought to be revised forward. I know the Trump administration and in particular the Space Council have been very aggressive in terms of trying to revisit old regulation and try to push these systems along as quickly as possible to come up. So that's that's a lifetime of work right there. But then when you look at the way things are regulated in space, originally there was no space regulation because there were so few actors in space. And space is huge, you know, so it's like there was no regulation of the oceans initially, right? Just got in your ship and went anywhere you wanted to. Then eventually people realized that, well, yeah, space was big, but if you're going to use it for communications, you had to do some coordination on radio frequency spectrum. So that was the beginning. And then they realized, well, there's prime real estate in space. The geostationary arc is actually more valuable with some technologies than other places. And so there originally was an effort to say, well, how do we regulate where people physically put objects? And now we fast forward again, and we're in the era of OneWeb and other companies where OneWeb is saying, look, we don't want to do it that way. We think a constellation of low-cost assets is going to be more powerful, a few assets in unique locations. And so every time the technology makes one of these huge leaps, the regulation is caught completely flat-footed, and it has to reinvent itself. And we're at one of those stages right now. And that's another great body of work. And then the last one I already mentioned is the desire, the need, the absolute necessity that we act responsibly and sustainably in space, that we can't just throw up hundreds and hundreds of satellites. We literally have had, after the great enthusiasm started on CubeSats, we literally had people throwing up CubeSats that don't have any kind of ability to maneuver or deorbit. I mean, you know, the rules, the UN rules are very old. They say an object can be launched for up to 25 years, which is way too long given the state of technology. And so again, once again, technology has moved so quickly past where we were, where our regulatory mindset is, that we need another revolution in all of the way we think about this. And at the same time, I do take to heart, I mean, I know this is another issue that the Space Council has been talking a lot about, which is trying not to make the regulations burdensome, and that is important. These technologies are moving quickly. We do need to manage them responsibly, but we need to do so in a way that allows for international collaboration and allows for the rapid development of the technology.
I guess I would just add, appropriate the word a diplomacy series, because I couldn't agree more that, to your point, that there, companies like OneWeb, companies like Virgin, we're just a couple examples here, but other countries have other companies. Universities are encouraging their students. High schools are having science projects where they're looking at sending satellites up to space. So there's a lot of space in space, but I agree that there will need to be advancements in international coordination, international bodies. Look, this exists a bit at the UN level, but there's a need, obviously, and a desire for people to go to space, use space. So it's exciting that the creativity and imagination being unlocked, but I would echo that we need to do so in coordination and in communication with each other about what we're thinking and trying to plan for. And government will need to catch up. Not stifle innovation and imagination, but to help do it in lockstep. And again, I think we've seen some of what the administration has done on space traffic management and space awareness to track objects in space. I think they've done so very collaboratively, I will say, with trying to take input from the private sector. And I think the private sector is going to push the boundary of government to move faster, I think, not just here, but there. Try to make sure we can stay.
To give one concrete example on this point, there is no international body for tracking objects in space. So by and large, individual governments do this to some extent. The United States Air Force has a catalog that it supports, but you'll see often, if you look at press reports, when there are these large launches where a number of satellites, tens of satellites get launched on the same launch vehicle, it is really, really difficult. There's not even today perfect communication between the people launching and the people whose job it is to track. And so you'll have days, sometimes longer, where they haven't cataloged the objects, and that means they don't know where stuff is. And that's a fixable problem. We know we can do much better than we're doing today. We just don't have the incentives yet to do better.
Great. So I think now we're going to come to the audience. If anyone has any questions. And if you could just please introduce yourself and where you're from, and keep it to be a brief question. Typical DC disclaimer.
Hi. Good evening. Great presentation. I wanted to ask Leonardo, press, what was disappointing?
I guess I'll try to answer that as the historian. So, you know, we know that a lot of the work that Leonardo did when he was imagining his flying machines was done in service of the military. And one of the things that he was most interested in was getting up high so that they could do more reconnaissance for military maneuvers. So I think he might be very impressed by our current reconnaissance technologies, both in satellites, spy planes, and you know, the remotely controlled drone aircraft. These are the types of things that he would have loved to be able to create during his time.
If I could jump in, that was actually the first thing I thought was drones, and not drones in the term, in the sense of military reconnaissance, but camera drone. Because you've got this great technology that's kind of, in a way, I could envision a Leonardo sketch of one of those quadcopter things. But at the same time, it's technology, but it's also a bit of art, because you're shooting this amazing video. And it's another way that we can get incredible perspectives. We had a drone footage for the first time. We flew a drone over a RS-25 engine test in Mississippi at Stennis Space Center. Those are the engines that flew on the shuttle. They're going to power the SLS. And it just so happened we put this drone up, the engine fired, this huge plume of white smoke that you always get, and a rainbow. And it was just one of our most liked things ever. So that's what I thought of when you said Leonardo.
Yeah, Mike Mercedes, PBS Online NewsHour. To take the regulatory discussion one more step, how close are we to creating an international regulatory body like the one that monitors civil aviation? Is it something 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, or is there an urgency to have something done sooner, particularly in a somewhat anti-regulatory climate now exists politically in a lot of places?
I think that the path that we're on will very much mirror the path that we followed in aviation, and that's that individual countries will have to make decisions and make investments in terms of how they want to control their citizens, and then there'll have to be a dialogue between countries as they make those decisions. I mean, we have the building blocks already. We've been talking about transitioning the responsibility from the Air Force to a civil agency for many years now. The Space Council recently re-engaged on that topic and had suggested that organization should be the Department of Commerce. United States Congress is not quite sure, so we have a little internal debate going on right now, and but that'll get resolved. So first of all, someone has to be responsible, and there has to be a regulator, and then we can go from there. At the same time, in a very, very, very preliminary sense, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, has a study group on space traffic management, which is like a very, very first step for them to start engaging internationally, mostly as a survey to find out what people are doing. So I think it's just going to take a lot of time, and hopefully we don't have any accidents before we get our game shoes on.
Name's Robert. I'm a high school student. A question. Virgin Galactic. In what ways has Virgin Galactic overcome the problems supersonic travel had back late thousands? What ways have they overcome like cost or like sound?
Well, our spaceship is on a mission that is much, much simpler in some ways. I mean, it's much more complicated in that we're going pretty much straight up very fast, like Mach 3, straight up. But we're not going long distance over people. And I think one of the greatest challenges that the supersonic transport faced was that there was the public was opposed to being exposed to the sonic boom. And so actually NASA recently funded a demonstrator. They're in the process of working now, I think it's with Lockheed Martin, to demonstrate a new body design that should greatly reduce the impact of the sonic boom. So in some ways, our job is harder because we're going all the way to space and then coming back, but in some ways it's very much easier because we do make a sonic boom, but it's in a controlled environment, so it's, you know, the public isn't exposed to it. We're on a range. Our spaceport in Las Cruces, New Mexico is next to White Sands Missile Range, so we're not near, there's not an affected population. So it's a different set of technologies, and I think that facing different challenges. But the challenges of supersonic travel and eventually maybe even hypersonic travel NASA is very much interested now and is re-engaged and has been trying to revitalize their aeronautics program, which had been less robustly funded over the years, but now they're trying to re-engage, and because there's such a tremendous number of exciting things happening in aviation at the same time that all this creative stuff is happening in rocketry.
My name is Alex Foster at Airjet Rocketdyne, so thanks for the RS-25 shout out. So General Hyten last year at the National Air and Space speech said one of the biggest challenges facing the space industry is the lack of excitement that his generation experienced in the 60s and 70s. And with not having seen Americans launch from American soil since the space shuttle program ended, how as a historian or as a journalist or as communicators, how do you guys generate the same excitement where the world, not just the United States, but the world stops and watches these historic launches to the moon, to the ISS, or beyond?
I'll jump in on that since part of my job is to try to convey the excitement of what NASA does. I think one of the challenges is we have so much going on, and I was thinking about this anyway when you were talking about aeronautics. There's a whole world of things that NASA does every day, and we sometimes try to talk about it all the time, and it makes it hard to focus on the big things. The other thing is, I said this years ago, and now my boss likes to quote me on it, is we have to sometimes step back and make sure we're not sucking the cool out of everything we do, right? As a government agency, sometimes that culture is there. There's a tendency to talk in corporate jargon or acronyms, or also just to be very matter of fact about everything and try to make everything feel routine because we want to emphasize that this is normal operations. But there is a certain wonder, especially when it comes to human spaceflight, that, you know, we have to step back a little bit and just let the cool things happen. Some of our biggest things that people get most engaged about are sort of word of mouth, community, naked eye astronomy, meteor showers. The eclipse was our most watched. Solar eclipse show was just our most watched thing ever. It was like Super Bowl-esque numbers on a viewing of this live show that we did, because everybody starts talking about it. And the bar that I say, the example I give sometimes for knowing when we're successful in this world is sort of the neighbor test or the in-law test or the friend outside of work test. If I've got people that stop me in my neighborhood, in my cul-de-sac, and say, hey, I hear NASA's doing so-and-so, then I know we've done something right, because it's gone past our audience that we know we're talking to and kind of bled over. But we also have to be realistic and understand that we're competing with so much else now than we were in the 60s during Apollo, with this focus and the space race focus and it being a huge national thing. Think about just the number of entertainment channels, the number of social media channels, just the sheer volume of information out there. So it is harder for us to break through sometimes.
And I would add a little bit of, robotic exploration to what you just said too. That, it's really incredible. There are 2 spacecraft out there at 2 different asteroids right now, collecting samples that are coming back to Earth for analysis. We're actually going out, getting pieces of the solar system and bringing them back to Earth for study. And there's a plan to do the same thing for Mars. We're working up to that with the Mars 2020 rover that will soon, I guess, have a more exciting name than Mars 2020. So I think we're doing incredibly exciting things in space. Maybe they don't get quite as much concentrated attention as Apollo did, because as you said, context, right? There was a reason why everyone tuned in to the Apollo moon landings. For one thing, it was a first, a really dramatic first, and at the same time, it was also part of this very large, all-consuming Cold War space race. So, it's not that we're not doing exciting things. I think we're doing lots of exciting things, but it's more dispersed.
Other gentlemen.
Thank you. Yvan Couran of Agence France Presse. A question for Katie. Can you expand on what responsibility means for OneWeb? What's the life expectancy of your satellites? How long will it take for them to fall back, burn?
Sure. Our life expectancy for our satellites is about 5 to 7 years. So we'll be replenishing our constellation regularly. And if I could just add on one more point about the imagination piece. On our first satellites that launched just this February, we launched our first 6 satellites of our constellation from French Guiana, and one of the logos that we branded on our fairing was FIRST, for FIRST Robotics. And if you haven't heard of FIRST Robotics, they're an incredible STEM organization that gets kids involved in building robots and gets them activated in the STEM field. And there's FIRST competitions where if you ever have a chance to go to one, they're the most incredible, inspiring events to see these kids building these incredible machines, and just the imagination and innovation that's coming out of that. I think the FIRST team has made 2019 the year in space, where all these kids who are involved in FIRST are learning about space and robotics, and I think the imagination is still being unlocked and opened, just more fractured. And so I do think we're going to see some places where hopefully, Mars, people going to space, it will test all of us like the eclipse did to watch and at a point in time. But I do think the advancements in space and the access of space, bringing pieces of it back, are definitely doing a lot in terms of imagination and creativity, where organizations like FIRST are. Hope that answered your question and further.
I think I heard one part of his question. I know you guys are doing this really well, and I want to make sure you guys get some credit for it. In planning your fleet, you also put a lot of thought into how do you sustain the environment that you're going to operate in. If you could say a few words about that.
Yeah. So to your point, thank you. Responsible space has been at the center of how we designed the constellation. So OneWeb's satellites, again, will be an initial 650 to create a global constellation of satellites that will deliver broadband service to rural, remote areas, but also connect people by air, land, sea. And the design of the satellites is meant to have them up for roughly 5 to 7 years and to have them disintegrate completely on their way back down. We're also, though, working with companies about how you capture satellites and bring them back responsibly. There's a lot of interesting technology that I don't want to get far overextended. I'm not an expert on, but we do have a team of experts at our company who spend time working with universities and others to have a conversation about responsible space and design and how we think carefully about not just the design of our satellites, but advancing technology that will allow us to go up, grab objects, and bring them back down responsibly. So I think there's a lot happening there, and it's something that we have hired a lot of really brilliant people at OneWeb about.
Christina Anderson, AWS. I have a question about a comment that was made by one of the space innovators recently about blending of high-tech. Do you see some of that coming in the future, and if so, how far in the future? And it seemed that this would be necessary for more ambitious. And the other question I had was about space-based qualifications. That Surf said that he was years ago, and I'm wondering where that was. Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you said high tech and first piece, I just don't know if I heard it. High tech and
human body, apparently. Some of the things that in the future, the human body is frail, long periods in particular. So we.
I mean, I don't know about the more sci-fi elements of that, but I mean, I don't know of any NASA plans on the books for that, but I know we do talk about, when we talk about extending humanity's presence into the solar system, I mean, part of that is, there's so much focus on the rockets and the spacecraft, but a big part of it is how do people live away from home from that long? Think about a crew on Mars. You cannot have a real-time two-way conversation with Earth. It's too much delay to get the signal back. So you have to be able to learn how to live independently. You have to live off the land. There's all of the, the wonky phrase in situ resource utilization, which a lot of us have probably heard, but it's living off the land. So, I mean, that doesn't exactly answer the sort of bionic cyborg sort of question, but I think technology is going to have to advance to support the life support side of it, as well as the rocketry and propulsion side. And another part of that equation is, I thought this was what you were asking at first. For years at NASA and in the community, some of us have probably heard this as this humans versus robotics debate. And much like the government versus commercial debate, it's really an all of the above approach. It's not a new space race. It's not one or the other. There's things that if you get to Mars that humans can do that robots won't be able to do, and vice versa. So, you want a robot that can go into that cave, into that dangerous place, and take a camera and scout, but you want a human that can make an instant decision on something using intuition and human knowledge without waiting on a command. So, I'm sorry, I kind of went afield from your question, but you inspired me to wax poetic about that.
Thank you so much. I'm Innocenzi from the University of Sassari, and I was for 8 years the Science Council at the Embassy of Italy in China. So my question maybe is really about science diplomacy. What do you think will be the future of cooperation in space with China, which is one of the main actors in space? I think this is a very critical issue that we have to think about a lot. What is your, I ask, opinion from you?
I'm just speaking as a citizen, not as Virgin Galactic. I mean, this is my own personal opinion. We cooperated with the Soviet Union and then Russia during periods of great tension between countries. I know there's a tremendous amount of focus these days, and thankfully it's beyond the purview of this panel, on where nations are going with their military programs in space. But I just would like to point out that we were able to cooperate with the Soviet Union and then with Russia during periods of very, very intense diplomatic disagreement. I think China will be a great space power, and they are committed and they are determined. And I think my personal opinion, I'm not speaking for Virgin or the American government, my personal opinion is that we should figure out a way to do collaboration. And I think that it would be a great benefit. We're going to go to Mars. I can't imagine why wouldn't we go as Earth, not as not just a couple of people.
I'm Rachel. I'm a writer and an environmentalist. Write environmental issues, and so my environmental impact. I'm wondering some of the specifics of cleaning up space. I know that Penn has some sustainability in space, but I don't know, like, it's kind of guiding. So I wonder if you'll be able to specifics on that. The other question is more relating to, I guess, climate-friendly, budget-friendly space travel and using fuels, rocket fuels that are, if there's anything like sustainable fuels that can launch a rocket. If that's something that I know one of the Virgins has at least plane airplane flight. I'm just wondering if that's something that could come down the pike of cost. Finally, where could virtual reality play a role in preparing space? I just read an article today from Nat Geo. Astrotourism, which Earth stars, nice dark around the and that's something I'll play a role in.
I can take the first part of the question about fuels and where we are with technology on debris mitigation, but I think the virtual reality question is also a great one, and I hope my colleagues can respond to that. We're really at the very, very, very beginning in space. We kind of put a bunch of stuff up. The laws of physics are that if you put something up, particularly at orbits that are beyond 200 or 300 miles, that it's going to stay up for a very long time. So we had I worked for a period of my life in the geostationary satellite industry, and what they do at end of life, because it's too far away, they're 23,000 miles away from the Earth, what they do is they actually push the satellites up another 300 kilometers or 500 kilometers higher. So they basically create a junkyard orbit. And of course, that stuff will, over 1,000 years, all come down. And we had a joke, which really isn't very funny, which people would say, "What happens in 1,000 years?" And we go, "Not my problem." So we need to get better. People are looking at a lot of technologies. There is a subcategory of space stuff called active debris removal. You'll hear people refer to ADR. It's at its infancy, because it might be possible, as Katie referenced, there are companies that are looking up going and capturing spacecraft and deorbiting them, which is hard, but you can get your mind around it from a technical perspective. The problem is for very small pieces of debris. Again, you know, a bolt traveling at orbital velocities can knock an entire satellite out or punch a hole through the space station. So getting small pieces, there just aren't any good ideas yet. We have a real deficit in good ideas. So I think we just have to acknowledge there's a lot of great work to do, and I think ESA does have some programs that it's funding. A European Space Agency is funding some programs. I don't believe that the U.S. government is, but I believe they should be. So, and I'll turn it over to the gentleman.
Yeah, so at the museum, we don't really talk much about virtual reality, but we do talk about what we call immersive experiences, which are the types of things that we create, for example, in our planetarium. So, you know, we aren't really into the whole goggles version of VR, partly because, you know, we get so many visitors per day that there's no way we could put them all in goggles, but we can get a large number of them into the planetarium. And then in each gallery, we try to have those galleries contain interactive exhibitry where people can explore solar systems that have been discovered by Kepler, for example, or they can walk inside of a physical mock-up of the mid-deck of the space shuttle. So we try to create experiences like that where people can become familiar with what they might see on NASA TV when they see, you know, people in the International Space Station or in other environments. We try to show them what those environments really actually feel like when you're in them. And one of the things we're playing with for the new gallery is to build a sort of mock-up of a prototype Martian habitat, for example. Show people what kind of quarters they'd be in if they were living on Mars.
I have a super quick VR story. NASA's done a lot with VR and also augmented reality, including like the guys out at JPL have a thing where they can simulate the Martian terrain and look at the rover and all that kind of stuff. So we had a demonstration at headquarters about a year ago, and it was a VR of the space station. And first of all, I made the mistake of standing up while I was doing this, so please sit down if you try this VR experience. But, you know, I tried to go through and float through the cupola and operate the robotic arm, and I was failing pretty badly. And I said, okay, fun. I took them off. I turned around. There was an astronaut, Alvin Drew, shuttle astronaut there with the thing on doing it. And I just thought, yeah, I'm going to defer to you on this. You probably are having a better time than I am. So stuff that happens at NASA headquarters.
I'm sorry, I'm very hungry, so I will try to make this land appropriately. I've got a question. I think this is mostly for Katie and Richard, but I'm wondering how private industry in the realm of commercial aerospace sort of is orienting internal moral compasses, sort of in lieu of this absence of like an international regulatory body that says this is how you serve a global citizenry. You have to make hardware that is environmentally friendly and that can't necessarily be hijacked for political purposes. Do you guys have like internal teams of ethicists that you consult to kind of serve this purpose better? Or how is that something that gets negotiated?
We have an ethicist in chief. His name is Richard Branson. And Branson really does look to all of his companies, whether it's aeronautics or maritime in his cruise ships, or he does want each company to strive towards and have a sustainability plan and be striving towards sustainability. or figuring out how to do things like offsets. So it's something that that came to us as part of the Virgin culture. So it's something that we do struggle with. Space, space is hard. Rockets are hard. Rockets do, depending on what kind of fuel you have, you may or may not be polluting. So I think we're at the very beginning of that whole process, but it's very much on our mind, and it's very much something to think about.
Last question will go.
Hello, I'm Rhoda Septilisi, and I'm very involved with the Explorers Club in New York. I was wondering of the three great billionaire giants that are sponsoring exciting programs. Do they, Bezos, Branson, and Musk, do they work together? Do they cooperate? Is the technology pretty much the same? I'm sure everyone wants to know. Thank you.
Pitch for my good friend Chris Davenport at the Washington Post. He wrote a wonderful book, which you should read, called The Space Barons, and he goes into great detail about the individual efforts of Branson, Bezos, and Musk. And I mean, they do know each other, and also Paul Allen, who recently deceased. I mean, they know each other. They do talk. They have individual visions that are quite different. And, Elon is, of course, Mars and has been from the very beginning. So I think there are intersections between the two, but between the three, but the visions are really fundamentally different. And they're pursuing their own dreams, I think.
We are unfortunately out of time. I know it seems like there are a lot more questions. Topic I'm fascinated by, so I'm sure we could keep talking all night, but unfortunately we can't. My biggest takeaways here are that technology is just getting smaller and cheaper and more accessible, and it's really fundamentally changing the space industry. Government is kind of playing catch up. We're going to have to watch and see how that plays out. There's a National Space Council meeting tomorrow where we'll hear a little more about that, but definitely something to keep an eye on in the future. And I just want to thank all of our panelists again so much for joining us, and everyone in the audience for being here and asking such great questions. Thank you all.